How does an elite British Special Forces squadron kill 54 people across dozens of night raids in Afghanistan without suffering a single casualty? Find an AK-47 rifle positioned in nearly identical fashion near almost every body, and write nearly identical after-action reports across 3 years of operations, only to have 11 of their own teammates later testify that children were handcuffed and shot. How does the British Ministry of Defence investigate hundreds of allegations of unlawful killings, spend £10 million on inquiries, and close those investigations without filing a single charge, only to have senior military officers later testify under oath that the chain of command deliberately suppressed evidence? And how does the most secretive regiment in the British military, operating under a culture of silence enforced for 8 decades, end up facing accusations that they maintained a kill board on the wall of their crew room, tracking murders like a scoreboard? Before we continue, tell me in the comments whether you knew that the SAS were accused of executing detainees in Afghanistan during this period. Because what you are about to discover is not a story about combat gone wrong. It is a story about what happens when elite forces believe they have a golden pass to get away with murder. Watch until the end, because the moment that defines this entire story is not the killings themselves. It is what the British military tried to bury before anyone could count the bodies. Then let's go. To understand what happened in the compounds of Helmand province during these years, one must first understand the war that preceded it, a conflict so grinding and politically fraught that it forced the British government to deploy special forces in missions they were singularly unsuited to conduct. Afghanistan, autumn of 2010. British forces had been fighting in Helmand province for 4 years by that point, deployed to one of the most unforgiving battlefields the United Kingdom had faced since the Second World War. The province stretched across southwestern Afghanistan, a river valley surrounded by desert, where the Helmand River created a narrow green zone of dense vegetation and traditional mud-walled compounds. Taliban fighters controlled much of the territory, despite the presence of thousands of NATO troops. Improvised explosive devices killed British soldiers with horrifying regularity. Firefights erupted in villages where distinguishing combatants from civilians required judgment, calls that could end lives or military careers. British deployment began in October 2001, weeks after the September 11th attacks on the United States. A campaign supposed to swiftly eliminate al-Qaeda. Safe havens had metastasized into full-scale counterinsurgency, showing no signs of resolution by 2010. British forces in Helmand numbered approximately 10,000 troops at peak deployment, tasked with stabilizing a province where the Taliban had operated freely for years, and where the local population viewed foreign soldiers with a mixture of fear, opportunism, and outright hostility. Prime Minister David Cameron led a conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, facing multiple pressures. Public opinion in Britain had turned decisively against the Afghanistan war. The question was no longer whether British forces would withdraw, but when and under what conditions. Cameron's government needed visible progress against the Taliban to justify continued deployment while simultaneously preparing for eventual exit. That political imperative created pressure for measurable results: body counts, high-value targets eliminated, Taliban commanders removed from the battlefield, metrics that could be reported to Parliament and defended to an increasingly skeptical public. The Special Air Service deployed to Helmand province on 6-month rotations, squadrons cycling in and out to conduct what the Ministry of Defense described as precision targeting operations against Taliban leadership networks. Their mission was straightforward in theory: identify Taliban commanders through intelligence gathering, conduct night raids to capture or kill them, and systematically dismantle the insurgent command structure. Operations followed a standard pattern. Intelligence from signals intercepts, informants, or surveillance would identify a target location. A squadron element, typically a troop of 16 men, would fly by Chinook helicopter to an insertion point after dark. They would approach the target compound on foot, using night vision equipment that rendered them nearly invisible to anyone inside. Explosive charges or sledgehammers would breach the walls. The compound would be cleared, room by room. Males present would be detained, or, if they resisted, killed. The squadron would extract by helicopter with prisoners or bodies. After-action reports would be filed, documenting the operation. Operational tempo was intense. Multiple raids conducted every week during active tour periods. The SAS worked alongside Task Force 444, an Afghan Special Forces unit trained by British and American advisors, who provided local knowledge and nominally gave operations an Afghan government face. The compounds they raided were family homes, traditional structures with thick mud walls, surrounding courtyards, and multiple rooms. Inside might be Taliban fighters. Inside might be farmers. Inside might be both. The distinction was not always clear in the moment when doors were kicked open and men emerged from darkness. British counterinsurgency required patient intelligence gathering, discriminate targeting based on verified information, and operations conducted with understanding that every civilian death handed the Taliban a propaganda victory and pushed fence-sitting Afghans toward the insurgency. Deployed instead was a force trained for direct action, optimized for speed and violence of execution, operating under rules of engagement that in practice gave enormous latitude to soldiers making split-second decisions in the dark. The regiment that arrived in Helmand in late 2010 carried 70 years of institutional history and a reputation built on some of the most daring operations in modern military history. The Special Air Service was founded in 1941 by David Stirling, a Scots Guards officer who convinced the British Army to let him form a unit for raids behind German lines in North Africa. Early operations involved small teams parachuting into the Libyan desert, destroying Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. That founding DNA of audacity, independence, and aggressive action had defined the SAS through decades of operations across multiple continents. By 2010, 22 SAS Regiment consisted of 4 Sabre squadrons, designated A, B, D, and G, each containing approximately 60 to 80 personnel, organized into 4 16-man troops. Selection for the regiment was notoriously brutal. Candidates endured weeks of physical and psychological testing in the Brecon Beacons of Wales, with pass rates typically around 10%. Those who made it through joined what was arguably the most elite military unit in the world, operating under a culture that prized self-reliance, initiative, and a willingness to operate in conditions where conventional forces could not function. The squadron that deployed to Helmand arrived with standard SAS equipment: C8 carbines with suppressors, tactical lights, and laser designators, Glock 17 pistols as sidearms, night vision goggles, and thermal imaging equipment that turned darkness into an operational advantage, explosive breaching charges, sledgehammers, and bolt cutters for gaining entry to compounds, flexi cuffs for securing detainees, combat medical kits for treating casualties, encrypted radio systems for communications, and helmet-mounted cameras that recorded everything. Those cameras were standard equipment by 2010, small devices attached to helmets that captured point-of-view footage of operations. The cameras served multiple purposes. They provided evidence for after-action analysis and training. They documented compliance with rules of engagement. They protected soldiers from false accusations by recording exactly what happened during operations. The footage was classified, accessible only to military investigators and command personnel. When the squadron arrived in Helmand, those cameras were considered a safeguard ensuring accountability. Within 3 years, That footage would become the evidence that senior British military commanders would work desperately to suppress. The regiment had faced controversy before. Gibraltar in 1988, when an SAS team shot dead 3 unarmed IRA members planning a bombing operation, sparked accusations of shoot-to-kill policies. Northern Ireland operations throughout the 1970s and 1980s involved cross-border incursions and killings that raised questions about rules of engagement and political oversight. But the SAS had always enjoyed protection from serious scrutiny. The nature of their missions required secrecy. Operational security demanded that methods and personnel remain classified. Parliament exercised minimal oversight. The regiment policed itself, investigating allegations internally and rarely finding fault. That system had worked for decades because the institutional culture valued mission success above almost everything else, and because the soldiers selected for the regiment were presumed to operate with judgment and professionalism, making external oversight unnecessary. But this system did not account for what would happen when a squadron arrived in a combat zone with unclear rules of engagement, political pressure for results, an operational tempo meaning multiple raids every week for 6 months, and a culture convinced that elite capability exempted it from constraints applied to conventional forces. The pattern that would eventually trigger an international inquiry began in the final months of 2010. November 16, 2010, brought an SAS element to a compound in Nad-e-Ali district, Helmand province. Operation Azada 11 followed standard procedures. Intelligence identified the location as a Taliban safe house, a squadron element inserted by Chinook helicopter several kilometers from the target. The team approached on foot through darkness, their night vision rendering the landscape in shades of green. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, explosive charges breached the compound walls. The team flowed through the breach, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency. According to the official SAS after-action report, the operation encountered armed resistance. 4 Taliban fighters engaged British forces with AK-47 rifles. In the firefight that followed, all 4 combatants were killed. The SAS suffered no casualties. No British soldiers were wounded. The operation was classified as a successful elimination of Taliban fighters in Nad-e-Ali district. Photographs documented the scene. 4 bodies. 4 AK-47 rifles positioned near the deceased. Mission complete. The family living in that compound told a different story. They described how British soldiers breached the walls while the household slept, how armed men in combat gear and night vision equipment ordered everyone outside into the courtyard, how the soldiers separated males from females, detaining 4 individuals. Saifullah, approximately 12 to 14 years old, had been helping his family harvest poppy crops. His father would later describe him as a boy, not a fighter. Abdullah, perhaps 2 years older, was also present. 2 adult men completed the group. The family heard the soldiers take the 4 away from the compound. Then they heard shots. When the bodies were returned hours later, Saifullah's hands showed marks consistent with restraint. All 4 deceased were found with AK-47 rifles near them in the official photographs. Saifullah's father gave testimony to Afghan investigators and later to international journalists. He described his son as a child who helped with farm work, who had no connection to the Taliban, who died because British soldiers wanted kills rather than prisoners. The father said he watched his son buried and understood there would be no justice. The British government was too powerful, the Afghan government too weak, international law too distant from the reality of compounds in Helmand province, where foreign soldiers operated with impunity. Whether Saifullah and Abdullah were Taliban fighters killed in legitimate combat or children executed after detention would become a matter of dispute. Undisputed was the outcome. 4 dead. No British casualties. No British wounds. 4 AK-47 rifles documented in photographs. An after-action report describing armed combatants killed during a firefight. 3 months later, the pattern continued. February 16, 2011, brought another raid to another compound. Loy Bog, also in Helmand province. The operation unfolded with the same rhythm. Night insertion, compound breach, clearance. 2 men detained, Mohammed Naeem Khan and Musa Khan. Officially, both were killed while resisting arrest. Both found with AK-47 rifles, both classified as Taliban fighters eliminated in the course of operations. Afghan autopsy reports told a more troubling story. Mohammed Naeem Khan died from gunshot wounds fired at close range, the kind of wound patterns associated with execution rather than firefight. His widow testified that her husband surrendered when the soldiers entered, that she heard a single shot after soldiers took him away, that the AK-47 found near his body did not belong to their family. Musa Khan's death followed the same pattern. Close-range wounds, family claims of surrender, followed by killing. A weapon found conveniently near the body. 2 days later, February 18, 2011, Kakaran compound. 1 male killed while detained. Same pattern. Armed combatant resisted arrest. AK-47 found with body. No British casualties. Operation successful. 3 operations across 4 months. 7 Afghan males killed. No British soldiers wounded. 7 AK-47 rifles found positioned near bodies in after-action documentation. 7 nearly identical reports describing armed combatants killed during firefights or while resisting arrest. The language in the reports was remarkably consistent. Armed combatant, engaged in combat, threat neutralized, resistance encountered. The phrasing varied slightly but followed a template suggesting either legitimate combat operations unfolding with extraordinary similarity or systematic practice of killing detainees and constructing identical justifications afterward. Royal Military Police investigators tracking incident reports from Afghanistan would later testify that by February 2011, less than 4 months into the squadron's deployment, the pattern was already visible to anyone examining the data. The kill-to-capture ratio for this particular squadron diverged dramatically from other SAS units operating during the same period. Other squadrons conducted raids resulting in mixtures of kills and captures, reflecting the complex reality of operations where some targets surrendered, some fought, some escaped. This squadron's operations showed a consistent pattern. Raids ended with bodies, rarely with prisoners. The statistical anomaly was obvious. No one with authority to investigate was looking. Inside the squadron's base, a physical manifestation of the culture driving those operations was maintained in plain view of everyone who lived there. Multiple former SAS operators, speaking anonymously to BBC journalists years later, described the same thing. A board. Physical. Visible. Mounted in the crew room where squadron personnel gathered between operations. The board tracked kills. Teams within the squadron competed against each other. Which troop had the highest body count? Which operators were most effective? The kills were quantified, recorded, compared. It was about competition, one former operator explained. About being the team with the most kills. 11 former SAS operators would eventually break the regiment's code of silence to describe what they witnessed during this period. Their testimony, compiled through an 18-month BBC investigation that would not air until 2022, provided a window into the squadron culture that official reports never captured. One operator stated flatly that it was murders. The categorical statement left no room for misinterpretation. Not mistakes. Not combat decisions gone wrong. Murders. Another described the killing of teenagers with a mixture of anguish and disbelief. The fact that it happened suggests a degree of callousness, he said, that contradicts the professional ethos. The kill board came up repeatedly in testimony. There was a kill board in the crew room with numbers on it. It was about competition between teams. Most haunting was the operator, who said simply that children were handcuffed and shot. How do you process that? The question was rhetorical. There was no processing children being restrained and then executed. There was only the fact that it happened, and the question of who bore responsibility. The testimony painted a picture of squadron culture where killing was prioritized over capture, where detainees represented paperwork and complications, while bodies represented operational success, where teams competed for the highest counts with the same energy other units might bring to training competitions or sports. The culture was not hidden or subtle, it was overt. The kill board was visible to everyone. The competition was acknowledged. The pressure to produce results manifested in the most direct possible way. More kills meant more success. Understanding how that culture developed requires examining the pressures operating on the squadron during those years. Operational tempo was intense. Multiple raids every week meant constant preparation, execution, and recovery cycles, with minimal rest between operations. The tours lasted 6 months, with only brief mid-tour leave. The threat was real. Taliban fighters in Helmand were experienced, well-armed, and motivated. IEDs killed British soldiers regularly. Firefights were common. The enemy was skilled and committed. At the same time, pressure from command for measurable results created incentives pushing operations toward efficiency. Captures were complicated. A captured Taliban fighter required interrogation, detention procedures, medical treatment if wounded, transfer to Afghan custody or a British detention facility, documentation, legal review. The process took time and resources. Killing a Taliban fighter was cleaner. The threat was eliminated. The paperwork was minimal. One after-action report describing an armed combatant killed in combat. Photographs of the scene showing weapons. Mission success. The squadron could move to the next operation. The term that would later emerge to describe the squadron's operating assumption was Golden Pass. The belief that the SAS, by virtue of elite status and operational necessity, could operate outside constraints applied to conventional forces. That belief was not invented by the squadron. It was reinforced by decades of institutional culture, by minimal oversight the regiment faced, by classification systems that shielded operations from scrutiny, and by political reality that governments needed the SAS to do things other forces could not or wouldn't do. Squadron culture developed unchecked. Competition dynamics prioritized kills over captures. Dehumanization of targets enabled moral disengagement. No internal voices challenged the practice, or if they did, they were silenced by the competitive culture and command pressure for results. Senior officers either knew about the kill patterns and approved them, or should have known and failed to ask necessary questions. The statistical patterns were visible to anyone examining operation reports with attention to detail. Command created pressure for metrics and results without ensuring those metrics reflected lawful operations. Commanders accepted reported successes without examining whether methods used to achieve them complied with law. By the end of 2013, when the squadron rotation finally concluded and new units arrived, the full scope would become visible only through statistical analysis that military investigators would not conduct for another year. Here is what 3 years of operations produced. 54 individuals killed across dozens of raids. No British SAS casualties during those operations. Not wounded, not killed. None. The kill-to-capture ratio was not just high. It was anomalous compared to every relevant comparison point. Other SAS squadrons operating during the same period conducted operations, resulting in significantly more captures relative to kills. Their after-action reports showed variation in outcomes, reflecting complexity of actual combat. Some operations ended with all targets captured. Some resulted in firefights where combatants were killed. Some produced mixed results. The statistical distribution suggested operations where soldiers made judgment calls based on specific circumstances rather than following a predetermined pattern. United States Special Forces operating in the same geographical area during the same time period showed higher capture rates. Their operations produced intelligence from interrogations that fed future targeting cycles. Dead men provided no intelligence. Captured Taliban fighters could be exploited for information about networks, planned operations, leadership structures. The strategic value of captures exceeded kills in counterinsurgency operations, where intelligence drove targeting effectiveness. Previous SAS deployments to Afghanistan, before this squadron's rotation, showed mixed kill and capture statistics, suggesting operations conducted with discrimination. Firefights occurred. Taliban fighters died in combat. But prisoners were also taken when circumstances permitted, and the distribution of outcomes suggested soldiers making case-by-case judgments rather than implementing systematic preference for killing. Against those comparison points, the squadron's record stood out. The pattern was not explained by chance, nor was it explained by superior tactics or training that somehow allowed this particular squadron to conduct raids so perfectly executed that they killed every target without ever suffering a single wound. The pattern suggested systematic practice. The weapons pattern provided additional evidence. Photographs from operation after operation showed AK-47 rifles positioned near bodies. The positioning was remarkably consistent, not clutched in hands, as might be expected if combatants died while actively fighting, not scattered at various distances, as might result from firefights. Positioned near the bodies, in photographs that looked similar enough across multiple operations to suggest staging rather than documentation of chaotic combat. The after-action reports showed a different kind of pattern, nearly identical language across dozens of operations. Armed combatant, engaged British forces, resisted arrest, threat neutralized. The phrasing varied slightly, but the structure remained constant. Experienced investigators looking at the reports noted that actual combat operations produce after-action reports with significant variation in language because the circumstances of each operation differ. Firefights unfold differently. Resistance takes different forms. Decisions are made in response to specific tactical situations. When dozens of reports across 3 years use nearly identical language to describe supposedly different operations, it suggests either extraordinary coincidence or template-based reporting designed to justify predetermined outcomes. Royal Military Police investigators established Operation Northmoor in 2014 to investigate 675 allegations of abuse and unlawful killings by British forces. As investigators began examining patterns in incident reports, the SAS squadron's statistics triggered concern. By 2015, RMP investigators had compiled analysis showing the squadron as a clear outlier. The kill numbers, the absence of casualties, the consistency in reporting, the weapons patterns. Taken individually, each element might have plausible explanation. Taken together, they suggested potential war crimes, warranting full criminal investigation. Investigators requested access to helmet camera footage that would show exactly what happened during operations. They requested authorization to interview squadron personnel under caution. They requested resources for forensic analysis of weapon evidence and autopsy reports. They flagged the pattern to their chain of command as requiring urgent attention and serious investigative resources. Instead, they encountered obstruction. For the Royal Military Police investigators attempting to examine these operations, Operation Northmoor became an exercise in institutional resistance. Operation Northmoor was established with a budget of £10 million and a mandate to investigate hundreds of allegations spanning multiple years of operations in 2 war zones. The scale was enormous. The investigative team was small, The allegations ranged from minor infractions to potential murder. Evidence was scattered across multiple databases, classified systems, and physical locations in Britain and Afghanistan. Building criminal cases that could result in prosecutions required access to witnesses, documentary evidence, forensic material, and cooperation of military commands, who controlled access to all of it. That cooperation was not forthcoming. Investigators seeking to interview squadron personnel found that authorization came slowly, when it came at all. Requests were delayed for weeks, then months. When interviews were finally authorized, they occurred under conditions limiting what investigators could ask and how they could pursue lines of inquiry. Witnesses showed reluctance to provide detailed answers. The culture of silence within the regiment meant that even operators willing to acknowledge concerns about the operations were unwilling to provide testimony that might be used against their teammates. Access to helmet camera footage became a particular point of friction. The footage existed. It was stored in classified systems. It documented exactly what occurred during breaches, clearances, detentions, and killings. For investigators, the footage was the best evidence available. It would show whether combatants were killed while actively fighting or shot after detention. It would show whether weapons were found near bodies or placed there afterward. It would either confirm or refute the official after-action reports. Requests for footage were met with classification barriers. Investigators lacked clearance to access certain material. The footage required redaction to protect operational security. The process of reviewing and releasing footage would take time. Months passed. Investigators pressed for access. The footage remained beyond reach, protected by classification levels and procedural requirements that effectively prevented examination. Evidence that was provided came slowly and incompletely. Documents arrived with heavy redactions. Forensic material was limited. Afghan autopsy reports existed, but their chain of custody raised questions about admissibility in British courts. Witness testimony from Afghan families was available, but presented in forms making verification difficult, and that defense attorneys would challenge as unreliable. The obstruction was not crude. No one explicitly refused to cooperate. Instead, cooperation came wrapped in procedures, classification requirements, operational security concerns, and resource limitations that collectively ensured the investigation could not progress effectively. Every request met with a bureaucratic barrier. Every barrier justified by legitimate-sounding rationale. The cumulative effect was to make thorough investigation functionally impossible while maintaining the appearance of institutional cooperation. Senior officers expressed concerns about the investigation's impact on morale and operational effectiveness. Prosecuting SAS personnel for actions taken in combat, they argued, would damage the regiment's capability and deter future recruits from joining special forces. The argument had superficial logic. Soldiers needed to know they would be supported when making split-second decisions in combat. Excessive scrutiny would create hesitation that could cost lives. But the argument did not address the difference between legitimate combat decisions and systematic execution of detainees. There is no operational necessity requiring soldiers to shoot bound prisoners. There is no tactical advantage in killing children. Rules of engagement and laws of war existed precisely to distinguish between lawful combat actions and war crimes. The investigation was not about punishing soldiers for defending themselves or killing enemy combatants in firefights. It was about determining whether these deaths represented legitimate operations or systematic murder. That distinction was deliberately blurred in the arguments against investigation. By 2019, after 5 years of work and £10 million spent, Operation Northmoor closed without filing a single charge. The official explanation cited insufficient evidence to prosecute beyond reasonable doubt. RMP investigators had identified concerning patterns. They had documented statistical anomalies. They had compiled testimony from Afghan families and whistleblowers, But they had not obtained access to the Helmand camera footage in usable form. They had not secured cooperation from key witnesses. They had not overcome the classification barriers and procedural obstacles that prevented assembling criminal cases meeting prosecution standards. The closure meant no accountability, no soldiers disciplined, no acknowledgement that crimes might have occurred, no policy changes announced to prevent similar patterns in future operations. The precedent was established. SAS operations in combat zones were effectively immune from prosecution, even when statistical patterns suggested systematic violations of law. For Afghan families, the closure meant no justice would come through British institutions. For soldiers within the SAS, it confirmed that the Golden Pass was real. For the chain of command, it meant a threat to the regiment's reputation had been neutralized. Files were archived. The investigation was over. Silence descended. But 11 members of the SAS, men who had served during the relevant period, men who knew what had actually happened in those compounds, were not willing to let silence be the final word. In July 2022, the BBC broadcast a Panorama investigation titled SAS Death Squads Exposed. The documentary was the product of 18 months of investigative journalism. Reporters had compiled Afghan autopsy reports, family testimonies, and statistical analysis of operations patterns. They had examined the Operation Northmoor investigation and its closure. They had documented the obstruction that prevented effective prosecution. Most significantly, they had convinced 11 former SAS operators to break the regiment's code of silence and provide testimony about what they witnessed. The decision those operators made to speak publicly represented a profound breach of SAS culture. The regiment's effectiveness depended on secrecy. Operations remained classified decades after completion. Personnel identities were protected. The details of what happened during missions stayed within the regiment. That wall of silence was not just policy, it was cultural identity. SAS operators simply did not talk publicly about operations. Doing so violated every norm of the institution. It invited social ostracism from teammates. It risked prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. It meant breaking faith with the regiment that had defined their professional identities. The 11 who spoke did so anyway. Their testimony described the kill board in detail. Multiple operators independently confirmed its existence, its location in the crew room, the competition it fostered. They described operations where detainees were shot rather than processed. They spoke about pressure from command for results measured in bodies. They characterized the squadron culture as prioritizing kills over captures to an extent that crossed into unlawful killing. The specific quotes were devastating. Most haunting was the operator, who said simply that children were handcuffed and shot. How do you process that? The question was rhetorical. There was no processing children being restrained and then executed. There was only the fact that it happened, and the question of who bore responsibility. The BBC broadcast triggered immediate response. Media coverage was extensive. Parliamentary questions were raised. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, demanded prosecutions. The Afghan diaspora community in Britain organized protests demanding justice. Political pressure mounted on the government to respond. The Ministry of Defense issued statements defending SAS operations as lawful and asserting that previous investigations found no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. The statements were technically accurate. Operation Northmoor had closed without prosecutions. But the statements ignored the question of why the investigation had been unable to access evidence necessary for prosecutions, despite spending £10 million over 5 years. They ignored the obstruction documented by investigators. They ignored the statistical patterns that triggered the investigation in the first place. Under sustained political pressure, the government announced a public inquiry. The Afghanistan inquiry, formally established in 2023, would be chaired by Lord Justice Haddon Cave, a senior judge with experience in complex military cases. The inquiry's mandate was to investigate allegations of unlawful killings by UK Special Forces during the relevant period. Unlike Operation Northmoor, which was a criminal investigation bound by prosecution standards, the inquiry operated under a different framework. Witnesses would testify under oath. Perjury penalties applied. The inquiry could compel testimony and document production. Findings would be published. Accountability would be public, even if criminal prosecutions never materialized. Hearings began in 2023. Testimony proceeded slowly through 2024 and into 2025. Afghan families testified about the loss of loved ones. RMP investigators described their attempts to examine the squadron's operations and the obstacles they encountered. Former operators provided accounts of squadron culture and specific operations. Forensic experts analyzed autopsy reports and weapons evidence. The helmet camera footage, still classified, was viewed in closed sessions. In December 2024, testimony reached the senior command level. Lieutenant General Mark Carlton Smith, who served as Director of UK Special Forces from 2019 to 2021, testified about his interactions with the Operation Northmoor investigation. His testimony, delivered under oath with full understanding of perjury consequences, revealed the extent to which senior military leadership had worked to suppress the investigation. Carlton Smith acknowledged warning investigators that pursuing the SAS inquiry could threaten UK Special Forces status and operational relationships with allied militaries. He characterized evidence that concerned investigators as subject to interpretation. He argued that the investigation risked undermining morale and capability. The testimony, delivered in the formal language of senior military officers, amounted to an admission that protecting the regiment took priority over determining whether crimes had occurred. Major General Paul Nansen provided even more direct testimony. He described senior military leadership as having attempted a cover-up. He stated that the chain of command deliberately worked to suppress the investigation. His testimony named no specific individuals beyond acknowledging institutional pattern, but the substance was clear. The obstruction that prevented Operation Northmoor from progressing was not incidental. It was deliberate. It came from the highest levels of British military command. The December 2024 testimony established what the BBC investigation and Afghan families had claimed for years. The problem was not just what happened in Afghan compounds. The problem was what the British military did afterward to ensure no one would be held accountable. Soldiers had killed detainees. Commanders had protected those soldiers. Investigators had been blocked from accessing evidence. Senior officers had prioritized institutional reputation over justice for the dead. The cover-up was not theory or allegation. It was documented fact, testified to under oath by the officers who participated in it. The Afghanistan inquiry has not concluded. No final report has been issued. No prosecutions have been filed. The helmet camera footage remains classified. But the testimony of December 2024 established beyond dispute that the question was no longer whether crimes occurred. The question was whether anyone with authority would ever be held accountable. Counterinsurgency operations required intelligence-driven targeting, discriminate use of force, minimizing civilian casualties, and operations conducted with constant awareness that population attitudes determined strategic success. Killing civilians, or even killing Taliban fighters indiscriminately, pushed the population toward the insurgency and made long-term stability impossible. Needed were forces capable of patient surveillance, nuanced judgment about who represented genuine threats, and willingness to capture rather than kill targets when strategic intelligence value outweighed tactical convenience of elimination. Deployed instead was the SAS. Founded in 1941 for raids behind enemy lines in the North African desert, the regiment's institutional DNA was aggressive direct action, training optimized for speed, violence, and efficiency. Operators were selected for physical capability and tactical proficiency, not for nuanced judgment in complex counterinsurgency environments. The skills that made the SAS effective at hostage rescue or strikes against conventional military targets did not translate directly to operations where the enemy was indistinguishable from civilians and where every tactical decision carried strategic consequences. That mismatch alone did not make crimes inevitable, but it created conditions where crimes became likely when combined with inadequate oversight and a culture prioritizing operational success above legal constraints. The accountability gap had architecture. Operational security classification prevented external scrutiny. Elite status created institutional belief that special forces operated under different rules than conventional forces. Self-policing mechanisms failed to identify or correct problematic patterns. Chain of command protected the regiment when investigations threatened its reputation. Political leaders lacked will to prosecute national heroes, even when evidence suggested crimes. Resource asymmetry meant small investigative teams faced institutional resistance from the entire military apparatus. The system was designed, whether intentionally or through accumulated precedent, to make accountability functionally impossible. Classification prevented evidence from reaching investigators. The culture of silence prevented witnesses from cooperating. Senior commanders framed investigations as threats to operational effectiveness rather than necessary accountability for potential crimes. Political incentives aligned against prosecution because convicting CIS soldiers for actions in combat would generate controversy and criticism that governments preferred to avoid. Squadron culture transformed human life into competitive metric. The kill board represented more than just scoreboard. It represented the transformation. Teams did not compete to achieve the best outcomes for British strategy or Afghan civilians. They competed for the highest body counts. That transformation required dehumanizing the targets. Taliban fighters became scores rather than human beings with rights under laws of war. The psychological distance between soldier and target expanded until shooting a detainee became tactically expedient rather than morally unthinkable. No internal voices challenged the practice effectively. Command either knew about the kill patterns and approved them, or should have known and failed to ask necessary questions. The statistical patterns were visible to anyone examining operation reports with attention to detail. The kill-to-capture ratio diverged dramatically from comparable units. The weapons patterns in photographs showed consistency, suggesting staging. The after-action reports used template language across dozens of operations. These patterns should have triggered command inquiry during the operations, not years later after investigative journalists exposed them. Command created pressure for metrics and results without ensuring those metrics reflected lawful operations. The failure was institutional. As of 2025, the Afghanistan inquiry continues. Testimony proceeds, evidence accumulates, but certain facts are already established beyond dispute. 54 people died in operations conducted by one SAS squadron. The kill patterns diverged dramatically from comparable units. 11 former SAS operators testified that detainees were executed and children were shot. Senior military commanders admitted under oath to suppressing investigations. No soldiers have been charged. No prosecutions have been filed. The helmet camera footage that would definitively establish what happened remains classified. No policy changes have been announced. The SAS continues operations globally with the same oversight mechanisms that failed to prevent or punish the alleged crimes. The institutional verdict has not improved with examination. The human cost cannot be measured in inquiries and testimony. Saifullah was 12 years old when British soldiers shot him on November 16, 2010. His father described him as a boy who helped harvest crops. The official report classified him as an armed Taliban combatant. His body was returned with marks on his hands consistent with restraint. An AK-47 rifle was found positioned near him in the photographs. His father buried him and understood there would be no justice. 14 years later, his father watches from Afghanistan as British institutions debate whether what happened constitutes a crime. Mohammed Naeem Khan died on February 16, 2011. Afghan autopsy reports documented close-range gunshot wounds, suggesting execution rather than firefight. His widow testified that he surrendered when soldiers entered their compound, that she heard a single shot after they took him away, that the rifle found with his body was not theirs. She was left with children to raise alone. No compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement that her husband's death might have been anything other than legitimate combat action against a Taliban fighter. 54 families experienced variations on the same story. British soldiers arrived at night. Someone they loved died. Officials classified the death as legitimate. Investigations went nowhere. Justice never came. The families are scattered now. Some remain under Taliban rule. Some fled to Pakistan or Iran. Some made it to Europe. None received answers about what happened to their loved ones, or why the soldiers who killed them faced no consequences. Investigations did not assess strategic value. Was killing these people worth more than the intelligence they might have provided if captured and interrogated? Did the operations disrupt Taliban networks effectively, or did they create new recruits by killing civilians and children? Were the metrics used to evaluate success, body counts and raids completed, relevant to the actual goal of counterinsurgency, which was population security and governance establishment? Those questions were never asked in the form that mattered. The squadron reported successes. Command accepted the reports. Politicians pointed to Taliban commanders, eliminated as evidence of progress. The human cost was externalized to Afghan families who lacked power to demand accounting. The strategic cost was invisible in the metrics used to evaluate operations. The moral cost was something the institution decided did not require examination. The irreversibility is what makes continued lack of accountability so devastating. No amount of inquiry will restore the lives. No prosecution will undo the trauma experienced by families. The children orphaned by those operations are adults now. The communities traumatized by night raids have lived with that trauma for over a decade. The soldiers who conducted the operations and the commanders who protected them continue their lives in Britain. Some retired comfortably, some still serving. The asymmetry is complete. Those who died are forgotten, except as statistics in investigations. Those who killed them remain protected. The 11 SAS operators who broke silence did not do so for career advancement or publicity. Their identities remain protected, but their professional futures within military or veteran communities are likely constrained by having violated the regiment's code. They spoke because they had witnessed what the British military would spend years trying to bury, and they decided that silence was complicity. They witnessed 54 families destroyed, communities traumatized, and justice systematically denied. The question that remains is not what happened during this period. The evidence has established the pattern. 54 people killed in operations conducted by one squadron. No British casualties. Kill-to-capture ratio anomalous compared to all relevant benchmarks. Weapons positioned consistently in photographs. After-action reports using template language. Helmet camera footage exists, but remains classified. 11 whistleblowers testified to executions and a killboard culture. Senior commanders admitted under oath to suppressing investigations. These are established facts. The question is what that pattern means for how democracies deploy elite forces in wars fought far from home, in conflicts where the enemy is indistinguishable from civilians, under rules of engagement, giving enormous discretion to soldiers, making split-second decisions, with oversight mechanisms that in practice provide no meaningful accountability. The SAS in Afghanistan is not an isolated case. It connects to broader questions about special forces operations across Western militaries, about the balance between operational effectiveness and legal accountability, about whether elite capability justifies exemption from constraints applied to conventional forces. Those questions remain unresolved. The Afghanistan inquiry will eventually issue findings. Perhaps prosecutions will follow, though the years elapsed and the evidence gaps created by obstruction make convictions unlikely. Perhaps policy changes will emerge, though none have been announced despite years of evidence that current systems failed. More likely, the inquiry will conclude with acknowledgement that problems occurred, with recommendations for reforms that may or may not be implemented, and with no individual held accountable for specific deaths. The knowledge that proved decisive was not held by generals or politicians or the institutional apparatus of military justice. It was held by the 11 operators who decided that what they witnessed demanded disclosure regardless of personal cost. It was held by Afghan families who refused to accept that their loved ones' deaths were legitimate combat casualties. It was held by journalists who spent 18 months compiling evidence that forced public attention. It was held by investigators whose findings were suppressed but who documented the obstruction they faced. The knowledge existed. Missing was the institutional will to act on it. If you think the story of what made these deaths possible, not the killings themselves, but the structure of decisions and silences behind them, deserves to be told fully, share this. Because this is not the first time elite forces believed they had a golden pass to get away with murder. The pattern runs considerably further than Afghanistan, and if you want to understand how the same institutional failures, the dismissal of legal constraints in favor of operational necessity, shaped British and American special forces operations across decades of conflicts, subscribe. The pattern that made Helmand possible was not invented in 2010. It was inherited from institutional choices made long before anyone deployed to Afghanistan. The 54 dead were never named publicly beyond investigation records,